This is Show Up as a Leader, a show from People Forward Network, helping you maximize your positive impact on the world by becoming your best, fully authentic self. Get ready to go on a superpower ride with this nonstop, jam-packed conversation I had with Mark Miller. He is the Vice President of High Performance Leadership at Chick-fil-A. He is the author of many best-selling books, and he just published his latest book, Smart Leadership, which we dig into. And it has so many tangible nuggets and things that you can put into practice right away. And he talks about our superpowers and how we can leverage them. And there's just such wisdom and nuggets. And really, you're going to walk away, have a notepad, because you're going to have all these tangible things that you can do. And you're going to want to go back and reference it. And bonus, at the end of the episode, he even gives you his phone number so you can actually reach out to him for questions. So go get the book, listen to this episode, and leverage your superpower of choice. All right, Mark, I am super excited to be talking to you because there is just so much synergy and alignment in our work. And I just love your new book, Smart Leadership. And so everyone needs to go out and get it. There's just a lot of really good, tangible nuggets in it. So I want to dive right in because obviously the show is called Show Up as a Leader. And we define leadership as maximizing our positive impact on the world by becoming our best, fully authentic self and supporting those around us to break past barriers and step into their greatness. And why I'm so excited to talk to you is that your work is all about that second part of our definition. It's all about the impact that we have and specifically how our choices determine the impact. So I just have to say that I appreciate the structure of your book because everyone, when you get it with Smart Leadership, that at the end of each chapter, you have this short little summary that you call Be Smart. And it's not long. And these are like things you can do now right away to put these things into practice. So just congrats. Well done on the book. And I am ready to just get right into it.
Good. Great to be with you.
So I want to get right into the good, messy stuff because that's the fun stuff, right? So you go right there in the beginning of your book and you state that if we're going to scale our impact, we have to be mindful of our quicksand, which I just love that. So can you talk more about what the quicksand is and why it's so important for people to be able to identify their own quicksand?
When we started this book, like all the work that I've done over the years, we try to address a current or emerging need. And so I'd love for your audience to understand the context. We started this pre-pandemic and we saw a lot of leaders struggling. And so we began, what is it that is impeding the effectiveness of leaders? Lots of desk research, lots of interviews, lots of case studies, surveys. You can imagine all the things that we did. And we heard things like busyness, distraction, complexity, meetings, email, text. The data on all that and the statistics are staggering. And so we began to socialize that with leaders as we're doing this work. And some of them said, I hear that, but that's not my situation. And I said, okay, so what's impeding your effectiveness? What's limiting your impact? And we heard another list. We heard things like fear, fatigue, aimlessness, even success. And so we decided to lump all of that together and say, this is quicksand. And each of us may be dealing with our own unique brand or mix, but it's the things that are holding us back. And so just to fast forward beyond that, we said, let's figure out what do leaders need to do. We quickly discovered that the quicksand is not the villain because a lot of leaders have developed the personal habits and disciplines to stay out of the quicksand. And if they ever get in it, they get out quickly. And so he said, the villain's not the quicksand. We're our own worst enemy if we've chosen to stay in the quicksand. So we shifted the focus of our research and said, let's study the leaders who've gotten out and see what we can learn from them. And that's the choices you just referenced.
I love that. Once upon a time, I was in a development workshop years and years ago, and the leader was interacting with one of the participants. And she said, you're standing in sewage and you're comfortable standing in sewage. It's like you're comfortable in the quicksand, or it's yep, life can throw stuff around us and it's what we do with that. It's the choices. And so that's a great transition into, I think about all that's going on in our world. There is a lot of quicksand
And as we're recording this, we're in the middle of the horrific tragedy that's going on in Ukraine, and we're still in a pandemic, and we've still got this global social justice crisis. It's like everywhere you turn around, it can be so easy to get sucked in to that quicksand. And I love the way you put this, where you say that our real superpower as humans is that power to make choices, which I really appreciate that. But I also just want to include one of my favorite quotes from Viktor Frankl. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose a response. In our response lies our growth and freedom. And why I think it's so timely is for people who aren't familiar with Viktor Frankl, right? He wrote Man's Search for Meaning and looked at people in concentration camps. Horrific. A lot of parallels, unfortunately, with what's going on in our world today. And there were people that were still able, not tragic optimism, not blind hope, but able to really go, I have a choice of how I respond to what's happening, of recognizing what I can and can't control.
And if we don't exercise those choices, we end up relying on instinct instead of choice. And if you go that path, you've only got three options when you're in the quicksand. One is just to give up, just to quit, just to die. You might not physically die, but your hopes and your dreams and your aspirations can be extinguished in the quicksand. The other instinctive response for a lot of leaders is I'm just going to swim in it. There are two fundamental problems. One is you're never going to win a gold medal swimming in quicksand, right? You'll never lead to your full potential. But the second problem, which actually becomes primary, is it's exhausting and it's not sustainable. So you try to swim in it long enough and you'll probably end up going back to choice one and you'll just quit. So the only legitimate option that remains is a bit counterintuitive. It's to choose to escape. When you do, then we've discovered some choices that'll help you.
And I want to piggyback on that, because one of the things that I do appreciate that you call out in the book that I think is important for anyone listening is not everybody has the opportunity to choose. There are very real constraints, systems of oppression, of challenges, whether, socioeconomic, of whatever ism, right? Various racism and other things, and just all kinds of situations where that ability for people to choose has been taken away from them, or has been quieted, or has been diminished. And so it's really important to call out that you recognize that in the book, and you talk about that we have to tend to that because it goes against a core human need. But you're talking about when we do have the choice, because I think that's a really important distinction. So if making choices that maximize our impact is going to be our superpower, you focus your book on what you call smart choices. Can you explain for us exactly what is a smart choice?
First, let me say that the typical human being, based on our friends in neuroscience, they're going to tell us you make about 30,000 remotely conscious choices every day. That's not what we're talking about. So we start with different types of choices. The smart choice being one of those options. And they are the choices that require more focus, more energy, yet yield a disproportionate return. They're like that first domino that trips all these positive benefits. They're cornerstone choices that if you can make these, a lot of good things are going to happen in your life and in your leadership.
Yeah, I think one of the quotes I noted from your book is you say, choices are the most important topic you rarely think about. And going back to our friends in neuroscience, because I like going back to this in our work too, that I think is important when you talk about I would say those 30,000, like those aren't choices. Those are autopilot learned habitual behaviors. I read a stat once, and I don't know what it is now, but once upon a time, neuroscientists estimated that 90% of our day we're on autopilot. And so it's like, how do we start to bring more consciousness and intentionality to it? But what I like is that you talk about how our decisions and our choices are actually really made in our limbic brain, which for people who aren't familiar with that, that's the seat of emotions. It's the part of our brain where we say we have a gut feeling or something, but it doesn't have language. So then what you talked about is that our rational decisions a lot of times are actually rationalizing the emotional decisions that we've made. And we could go on a whole other tangent about this, but what this brought up for me is just the importance that we're hearing more and more today, like Susan David's work about why we have to build emotional agility, and the great work of Mark Brackett of, permission to feel and emotional intelligence, and being able to actually name and recognize and process our emotions. Do you think that for us to be able to make smart choices, that we have to be, as Mark Brackett would say, emotion scientists, or we have to be more emotionally literate or emotionally agile? Do you think that's a piece of the equation?
Yes, I do, but I don't want to set a barrier to entry. Always great for humans, leaders specifically, to maintain high levels of self awareness, which actually goes to the first choice. You may not want to go there quite yet, but it's hard. It's hard. I don't want to make it harder by telling people they have to become a emotional neuroscientist. It's like you do need to maintain high levels of awareness, and you need to do things in your life to remove and minimize the blind spots in your life because they are not your friend.
No, they're not. That's a great segue into the four smart choices. So I do want to dig into those because I think that they're relevant and they're very tactical. And I want to say that I love how for each of the four smart choices, you look at them from both a macro and a micro level, if you will. So you give some macro suggestions of kind of general things to be thinking about, which can be bigger and almost feel overwhelming. But then for each, you have a separate chapter where you dig in depth with what you call two specific practices for each of the choices. So you make it very actionable and okay, with all these macro things, where can I start? Boom, right? Start with these two practices. So with that, let's start with your first smart choice, which you call confront reality. And I have to tell you that I laughed when I read this section because this is what my daily life is that I encounter when I am coaching leaders and working with teams. So before we get into the tactics, like why do you think it is so hard and so many leaders have trouble confronting reality?
That may be above my pay grade to tell you why, but I can tell you, I've asked a lot of leaders if they know leaders who have trouble confronting reality. I never want to ask a leader, do you have trouble confronting reality? Let them talk about their friends and neighbors and families and their boss. And they all go, oh, yeah, let me tell you. And they tell me stories. And I made a partial list in the book. They talk about fear and they talk about anxiety and they talk about pride. So are those manifestations of something deeper? Again, maybe you're the doctor, you'll have to help us with that. But it's just not a healthy place for a leader. You need to be grounded in truth if you're going to lead to your full potential. It serves no one for you to be delusional, for you to hide, for you to minimize, for you to exaggerate. It's like truth really is a leader's friend.
I want to say it's gosh, I might be getting the wrong person. I want to say it's Gloria Steinem, but I think she says the truth will set you free, but first it'll piss you off. It's
I've
like,
heard that. I've heard that.
yeah, we could get into the whole psychology of it, but I think with what you put in your book, I think it comes down to it's our own humanity and it's our own need, instinct to self protect. It's where our emotions get the best of us. And as Brene Brown says, we armor up, we go into self protection mode. And when that stuff happens, the fear, the anxiety, it's an instinct that then keeps us from wanting to confront reality because it feels too scary or it feels too unsettling. So I wanted to start with that because part of this podcast is normalizing that messiness of being human and recognizing we all do it. But to your point, we have to recognize that because not confronting reality, not confronting the truth isn't really helpful to anybody. So with that, you say that as a smart choice, we confront reality to stay grounded in truth and lead from a position of strength. So what are some of the tangible ways that we can make good on this choice?
This is going to sound too simple, so we probably don't want to dwell on it, but I feel like I have to say it. The choice is initiated by the leader. You make the choice before you pursue the practices. The practices are going to fall on deaf ears if you don't say, yes, I'm willing to confront reality. And the choices are, I don't want to say they're everything, but they're the keys that unlock this impact. There's so many practices. It was really hard for me just to put a few practices to support each choice because you might argue they're infinite practices once you make the choice. And I think leaders have to decide, I want more impact. I want more influence. Somebody said, why should I do this? Literally. And I wrote a paragraph in the book that you may have not even have noticed, but it was early, trying to address the leader who read the manuscript and said, why would I do all this? And I said, you're a leader. You've got hopes. You've got dreams. You've got aspirations. You've got potential. Your organization has potential. You don't have to justify to me what you do and what you don't do, but you got to live with yourself. You do this so that you can have more impact on the world. And after I explained it to this leader that asked me, they went, oh yeah, I never thought about it that way. So I wrote that paragraph in the book going, here's why this matters. Not because my team did all this research and we came up with these 4 cute things. These are the keys to get you out of the quicksand and scale your impact. And it just starts with that choice. I want to do that. Therefore, I'm willing to confront reality. One quick story on that. I talked to a leader yesterday, the day before. He read this section of the book and he put it down. And I said, am I supposed to be encouraged by that? And he said, I was convicted. He said, I hope I'm going to pick it back up. But he said, I'm not willing to make the first choice. He said, I've been in denial for so long on so many things. And I said, problem well defined is half solved, but there are more choices. There are more choices. So I'm hoping he's going to pick the book back up. But he's got a high level of self-awareness. If he's thinking, okay, here's my first problem.
Well, that gets into then when you get into some of the specific behaviors, you talk about that, you talk about self-awareness and knowing yourself, and you call it check the mirror. And I love this chapter. You actually start with a story of one of my favorite people, Kristen Hadid, who's a friend of mine, and she was on this podcast early on, and where she tells the story of in the early days of Student Made, of her mess up of 45 of her 60 people literally just walking out on her and just quit. So talk to me about the importance of checking the mirror as it comes to confronting reality.
Well, I think it's huge, but I also think it's first. When you talk about confronting reality, I think if we're not careful, we may want to look at others, and you'll have time to do that. And there may be things that you need to confront about your team and about your relationships and about your health, but start with you. So I think the first thing that is important about it is the sequence. A lot of the issues you are facing are self-inflicted, and you got to come to grips with that. And so I think that's the significance, not just of the content, but of its positioning.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because sometimes people, they want to be in this web of blame. And it doesn't mean that there's not, I don't even like to use the word blame, but that there's not multiple people or contextual factors that are contributing, but it's looking at what role am I playing here? Is it I didn't speak up? Is it that I didn't set a healthy boundary? Is it that I wasn't clear? Is it that I waited too long to handle this and then it got bigger than it needed to? The list goes on. And so what I like about this is, it's like we have to own our part. We have to look in the mirror and go, what part did I play in the current state? Like I played a role. I can't just cast the web of blame all around me. And that can be unsettling to do. And the other thing I like about the mirror analogy is a lot of times what I say to the leaders that I coach is the people that are getting under your skin or frustrating you or pissing you off the most, it's usually they're holding up a mirror because they're reflecting stuff right in yourself that is unsettling to look at. And that's why that button gets pushed. So I so appreciate that because we have to own our own stuff. We have to. So you look at your own stuff, you look in the mirror, you check the mirror. Your second specific action to confront reality, you call it review your crew. Can you share a little bit more about what that entails?
It's just really about your team. John Maxwell, some of your listeners will know that name, friend and mentor of mine for many years. He said those closest to you will ultimately determine your level of success. And so I'm going, okay, let's talk about how good is my team as a group and individual players and how well are they functioning together. So in that particular chapter, I've got several questions as in the previous chapter, but specifically some things you can ask to help you discern, are there things you need to confront as it relates to your team?
I think sometimes are there issues or gaps or developmental conversations I haven't been happening? Are there opportunities I haven't been giving someone to really help elevate them? And one of the things you talk about it somewhere in here, but we always say as a workplace, when you get intentional about your culture, and as an individual, when you start to get intentional about, hey, I want to maximize my impact, and then you start looking at, do we have the right people, like the right skill set, but also the right level of emotional intelligence and alignment with our values and whatnot. It's very normal that not everybody survives the transition going to the next evolution. And sometimes that's okay, because if someone's a square peg in a round hole, it's frustrating for everybody and they can't use their gifts and talents, that they can't maximize their impact, and you get held back.
And one of the questions that I've got in there, and some would argue that it's the hardest one of all of the questions in that chapter, is can your existing team take you where you want to go? Because they actually might be performing well at your current level. But if you're trying to double, triple, or 10x your influence and your impact, your sales, your scale, your whatever, those are real hard questions that the best leaders are willing to ask.
It's interesting you say that, because there is a lot of work I'm doing these days with leadership teams where they are looking at whether they want to file for IPO, or whether they are looking at, oh my gosh, like you said, the pandemic really, I think, illuminated where there are strengths, but it also illuminated holes, right? It is a reflection of what's happening. It amplifies our current state. And we use this tool called the collective leadership assessment, which looks at where's our current state, where do we want to be, and what's the gap, and can help close that gap. But my point being is that I'm seeing this more and more where they're going, if the last couple of years have illuminated anything, it's that kind of the what got us here may not get us there. And so we do have to be thinking about, yep, we're humming along great now. And what are we going to need to upskill, think differently about, shift in our dynamics to get where we want to go, because this world isn't static.
One last closing thought. This is hard. So you can look at, not that this would even be appropriate, but you could probably rate these 4 choices and say on their easiness to difficulty scale. This one for so many people is hard, even for some of the reasons that we referenced earlier. So I've got one more tip. And again, there's a lot in the book we can't get into, but I want to honor the people that are going, this is hard. You don't have to do this by yourself. There's a section in the book called Finding Fresh Eyes. Can you get a coach? Can you get a mentor? Can you get peers to help you? Can you hire a consultant? There are any number of ways to get others to help you. Because if it's a blind spot, you may need help seeing it. Or if it's just something really hard that you don't want to own, to have another voice or voices. Maybe, do you have a personal board of directors? There are any number of tactical ways to play this out. But don't feel like you have to do this by yourself.
Yeah, I love that. We always say this isn't a solo journey, right? We are neurobiologically hardwired to be in connection as human beings. And you think about any kind of change, it takes a village, if you will. So I love that. Love that. So let's talk about smart choice number 2, which is grow capacity. So what you say is that as a smart choice, we grow capacity to meet the demands of the moment and the challenges of the future. So again, there are some macro things we can do, and then you give a deep dive into 2 specific practices. So let's talk about them. So for starters, what are some of those macro things that we should be thinking about kind of in the context as we think about growing capacity?
I think this is something leaders should think about all the time. And sometimes we get busy, we get distracted. Oh, there's quicksand. And it keeps us from thinking about this. I remember I had a young leader come to me years ago, and he said, hey, I got a question. He said, when the senior leaders meet, do you talk about men and women who have kind of reached their limits, like they're out of capacity? And I said, very rarely. And he said, well, that's odd. I said, well, why do you say that? He said, well, I would think you'd talk about those people a lot. I said, nope. We talk about those that have been able to grow their capacity, because that's what we need. We've got a growing organization. We've got a growing enterprise. But too many leaders look at capacity as fixed, and it's just not. Our boundaries way out there somewhere, and I've met very few humans who've tapped it all. There are just so many things you and I can do as leaders to grow our capacity. Again, it starts with a choice.
So with that being said, let's get into the 2 specific practices that help grow capacity. So the first one you say is stop and think. So let's talk more about that.
The team did a lot of work, a lot of research, months and months, a couple of years worth. This was one of the, I want to call it a surprise, maybe even an insight. What we discovered is the best leaders for thousands of years have margin in their life. Now, to men and women in quicksand, that sounds crazy. In fact, I had one leader who I thought was going to hit me when I started talking about this. And he was virtually unhinged. It's like he said, "You have got to be kidding me." Now remember, he's in quicksand. And he said this, "I don't have time for a vacation." I said, "Here's the deal. You may or may not need a vacation. That's not what I'm talking about." He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "I'm talking about a leadership discipline." He said, "Tell me more." I said, "When do you purposefully allocate time to reflect, to assess, to think, to create, plan? When do you do that?" And he looked at me and I said, "That's why you're in quicksand." "And how much time do I need?" I said, "I don't know." I said, "But the bigger your dreams, the bigger your problems, the bigger your challenges, the bigger your opportunities, the more time you need to reflect, to assess, to think, to create, and to plan. How you think you're going to get out of the quicksand? That may be the number one thing you need to think about. Now, you probably got other things you need to think about and reflect and create, but let's start with how do you get out of the quicksand? You're not going to get out unless you have some margin." And I said, "By the way, who in your organization is reflecting, assessing, thinking, creating, and planning if you're not doing it? Because my bet is if you're in quicksand, you've drugged them in there too." You got to have some time. I know a guy who became the president of a company, multi-billion-dollar company, and he said the first thing he did was he doubled the amount of margin in his calendar every month. He said he didn't think he had any choice because he understands it's a leadership discipline.
And I don't remember where the stat comes from, is that the most effective leaders spend at least 5 hours a week on deliberate reflection and learning. And that could be reading and reflecting, pausing and reflecting. But to your point, it's having that space. And so I encourage, like, can you find an hour a day? And people freak out. Okay, fine. Baby steps. Start with half hour a day. Start with half hour in the morning, half hour at night. And I know myself, when my weeks get jam packed and I don't have that space, I feel exhausted, but it's also you end up even more reactive, right? You can't be proactive. You cannot be strategic when you aren't pausing and thinking and reflecting. So I love that because it's so counterintuitive, but it's Kevin Cashman calls it the pause principle. We have to slow down to speed back up. And I think that gets lost in so many people in this fast-paced world. So if you do nothing else, start to practice pausing, build in that buffer time or reflection time or whatever you want to call it. And I think whether you're a formal people leader or not, we all need that, because how often are you just reactive in your life too? I just think that's a universal principle beyond leadership too. Okay, so the second specific practice to grow your capacity is expand your energy. So can you share more about what you mean by this and how people can actually put this one into practice?
Yeah, let me back half a step. For what we just covered, I want to challenge everybody listening, find 2 hours next week and put on your calendar, meeting with me. And when somebody wants that time, you look at that and you go, "Oh, I'm sorry, I've already got a meeting." Now, I don't know if you need 2 hours. You may need 4. You may need 6. You may need 8. You may need 20 minutes. But if you're not well-versed and practiced in the discipline of margin, try it. 2 hours next week. So I didn't want to miss that. Okay.
I love that. Meeting with me. I call it buffer time, but you know what? I'm going to change it to meeting with me, because literally I see buffer time on my calendar and mentally where I go is, oh, someone wants to schedule something with me. Oh, that's just my buffer time. Sure, I can take that. And I'm like, God, I put so I'm going to change my buffer time to meeting with me. Love it. Thank you. Okay. Next.
Here's the deal. I know leaders who know that they're in quicksand and they don't have the energy to get out because it's hard. And so I really don't know that we need to dwell on this because there's actually nothing new. I felt awful having to write about this because it's like, are you getting enough sleep? Are you eating right? Are you getting enough water? Is there appropriate levels of recreation in your life and healthy, life-giving relationships? Really? Well, yeah, because you've got a plan as a leader for virtually everything else. You've got a plan for innovation. You've got a plan for strategic growth. You've got a plan for cost control. You've got a plan for quality. You got a plan for marketing. It's like, why don't you build a plan for personal energy management? Oh, by the way, did I mention exercise on that list? It's like, but the data is so clear and so compelling. So why don't people do it? Oh, they've not made a choice to grow capacity. If you don't have energy, assuming you don't have some medical condition, which those exist, let's give those people a pass and hope they get better. Everybody else, you have so much control over your personal energy if you'll choose to expand your energy.
I love sometimes even the reframing, because I've been talking to leaders about self-care, and that the most effective leaders and people, quite frankly, because we look at leadership is behavior, not necessarily a title or a role. The most effective leaders, the most effective people are highly boundaried, and they are diligent about their self care, because they recognize, if I don't care for myself, I am no good to anybody else. And so, what I wonder about this, about language, for anyone listening, if you struggle with this idea of self care, or it feels selfish, even though all the data out there says otherwise, if you shifted it to energy management of, what do I need to give me the energy to be able to look at this? What do I need to have the energy to be able to handle this challenge that's going on in my life right now? And that will look different for everybody. And it might look different by the week, depending on what's going on. But I love the idea of looking at it from an energy standpoint. So that's fantastic. So speaking of energy, it actually is a nice segue into smart choice number 3, because you call it fuel. So you say that as a smart choice, we choose to fuel curiosity to maintain relevance and vitality in a changing world. So what are some of the macro things that we should be thinking about to fuel curiosity?
Again, I'm going to go back. This is sounding like a bit of a broken record. You have to make the choice. That's the macro of macro. People have asked me for years, in one form or another, is there a leadership fountain of youth? And what I used to say is, I hope so. And I'm looking for it, right? Because I want to add value till my last breath. This is it. Curiosity is the leadership fountain of youth, and it's in you, whether you acknowledge it or not. And if you don't believe me and your parents are still alive, ask them about you as a small child, or observe a small child, and they are so curious. So it's really a plea with leaders to fuel, to rekindle, to reignite that innate curiosity that you may have suppressed, you may have squelched. It will help you lead at a higher level. I think that's the macro of macros. Is I just meet too many leaders who don't see themselves as a curious person. You're choosing to limit your impact if you believe that lie.
Absolutely. We talk about it in terms of choosing a learner path or a judger path, right? Or a curious path or a knower. And so many people feel like they have to know it all, or they have to have the answers, which is a very armored way of showing up, versus it's vulnerable to be a learner. It's vulnerable to be curious, because you don't know what you're going to find, but super essential. So that gets into the first specific practice you have of fueling curiosity is ask, don't tell. Say more about that.
The best leaders ask the best questions. And the best leaders ask more questions than their lesser counterparts. And this has just been a progressive revelation. I was actually not surprised when this fell out of the research, when we said, it seems like leaders ask a lot more questions. That makes a lot of sense. It makes so much sense. One quick story about that was Jim Collins, Good to Great, Built to Last, that Jim Collins. He was speaking at one of our events, and he challenged us to double our question to statement ratio. And so we started, while we were thinking about that, I like 6,000 people in the room thinking about what would that mean? How many questions do I typically ask in a day? And while he's letting the group process this, he said, and then double it again. Everybody wins when the leader masters the art of questions. Everybody gets smarter. The leader actually gets smarter because there are things we actually don't know. The people we're asking the questions of get smarter. It's a sign of our humility as a leader. And I think it's a grossly underutilized skill set for leaders.
No one ever learned more by talking more. They learn by listening and questioning. And the second specific practice to fuel curiosity, I just laugh because I'm like, this goes against everything we were taught when we were growing up of don't talk to strangers, because you say we should talk to strangers. And I just think if we seek out people who are different than us and don't, that again goes back to curiosity, that's how we learn. So I love that. So let's talk about smart choice number 4 is create change. And you say that as a smart choice, we create change today to ensure a better tomorrow. And the first specific practice that you dive into for creating change is see the unseen. And as soon as I read this part, it reminded me of one of my coaching certifications, intrinsic coaching. There's a statement that we anchor everything on of there's more than what's merely apparent. Right. So when you see someone behaving in a way you don't agree with or whatever, you always go, there's more than what's merely apparent. And so anyway, that's what stood out to me. So can you share what it looks like in practice to see the unseen?
Sure. And I love the application that you just referenced. I'm going to pull up one click and say, this is really about vision. Some leaders aren't ready to create change because they don't have a compelling preferred future. They don't have a picture of where they're trying to take the team or the organization. Now, some people don't do this because they don't have confidence in their own agency. They don't understand that they actually can affect change. The internal, external locus of control is they think it's all controlled by others. Well, you hope those people aren't leading, but because if they are, they're going to have a really hard time. But this is about articulating a preferred future because it's going to create passion in you and hopefully help you rally those around you to make it a reality. Leadership always begins with a picture of the future. If you don't have a picture of the future, I'm not sure what you're doing, but you're not going to convince me you're leading.
Yeah, because there's not a just cause or something people are working towards, and then you don't have the energy, you don't have that buy-in, that passion. Totally get it. So the second specific practice that you talk about to create change is sharpen your tools. So what are some of the tools that we have that we need to sharpen and leverage in order to effectively create change?
This was another of those chapters, almost like the diet and exercise chapters. Like, yeah, do we really want to write about this? Because here's my belief. Most leaders don't need any more tools. They need to use the tools they got. Tools like vision, tools like their teams, tools like problem solving, tools like measurement, tools like accountability. I'm defining tools broadly, but just the stuff you do to orchestrate a change, to create change. It's brainstorming, it's innovation, it's the tools that are already out there that leaders aren't using. There's something interesting about tools. If you think about it very tactically, there's latent power in a tool, but it only comes to life in the hand of the one that wields it. So brainstorming is powerful, vision is powerful, accountability is powerful, measurement is powerful, only when you apply it, and only when you use it. And so I'm just encouraging leaders, do the things that you know to do. Now, you may need to sharpen those tools. You may need to dust some of them off. You may need to go to a coach or a mentor or a consultant to say, help me get better at doing X, Y, Z. But you probably don't need a new tool set. If you're a leader, you already got the stuff in your bag that you need. You got to choose to create change, which will give you energy to pull out the tools.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you. And I would also say, though, that there are some people. So if we're talking about, I look at if anyone has the opportunity to show up as a leader, some people haven't been equipped with skills and tools. And even people who are in a formal people leadership role, if you look at the data, that a lot of them aren't actually developed. So they may have some of the tools, they may not. But what I appreciate about what you're sharing is, and what I've been finding, particularly over the last year, is I think people are recognizing because there's been so much change in our world, rather than adding on a whole bunch of new stuff or the next shiny object, we've been just doing a lot of bringing people back to the basics, or we call it getting your house in order. And in our development programs, principles of spiral learning, let's just keep coming back to these concepts and reinforcing and getting you to create deliberate practices to use this stuff And then you, right, can take it to the next level. So I want to shift gears for the last part of this a little bit in that, and this kind of, I think, gets into quicksand. So one of the goals of this podcast is to normalize the messiness of being human, and that there's not a straight line to leadership, and that no matter how successful you've been, no matter how many books that you've written, that guess what? We get stuck in quicksand, or our quicksand shows up. Maybe we don't get stuck, but we all have quicksand, to use your words. What I know is that we all, in the words that I use, is we all have stories we tell ourselves that keep us safe and small. In your words, quicksand. So what I would love to hear from you is, what is a self-limiting story that you still tell yourself sometimes? And when it shows up, how do you move beyond it so that you can still show up as a leader?
Let me share a story that others keep telling me that I'm trying to overcome. I have decided, for good or for ill, that I'm going to write. And I think I've got some things to say. And I continue to have people tell me that people don't read books anymore. And actually, my former publisher told me that people don't read books anymore. And I'm not willing to accept that. And maybe there's still truth in there, that maybe people are reading less. What I'm telling myself, the second half of your question, is I'm saying the book helps me codify truth. And then I need to be creative on other ways to leverage that content. And whether that be, I'm working right now on a couple of graphic novels with a former creative director from Marvel. What we're doing is we're trying to leverage, maybe it's a book people aren't going to read. Maybe they'll read a graphic novel, or maybe we're trying to find other channels, and we're trying to create, there's chatter about creating courses and other things that might leverage and help me better steward the content. But I'm not willing to accept on face value, people don't read books anymore, so therefore I shouldn't write books. So I've been dealing with that for almost a decade, because you probably know the trends are not good in the publishing world. I don't think that means books are dead, and I don't think that means it's not a good discipline for me, because had we not been trying to write this book, we wouldn't have had the focus, the energy, the effort, and potentially the discipline to go through the process to codify our learnings.
So I love that when like a limit's being placed on you, or you're looking at, do I take that in? I can find a window to go out, or I can find another path. It doesn't have to look the way I thought it was going to, or I can get creative. So I love that. You're rallying your resourcefulness. And I don't believe that books are dead. I don't care who says that. And it's not just because we have some out as well. I buy them all the time. I have, and you look at any news program, maybe they're fake backgrounds, but like all these people are standing behind their bookcases with all the books. I don't know. I would challenge that one. But anyway, okay. So we're gonna move into our quick questions segment, if you're game for it.
I'll try.
All right, here we go. Fill in the blank. Living authentically is
stewarding what has been entrusted to you.
when the world is presenting an opening, but you don't feel like showing up as a leader. What do?
Ask what is required.
What's something people would be surprised to know about you?
That my favorite thing to do is to play with my grandchildren.
Oh, how many do you have?
3.
How fun. How fun. What is your favorite go-to movie?
Harry Potter.
All of them, or any of the specific?
All of them. I love the scene, and I even write about it in my book. I love the scene when Hagrid tells Harry that he's a wizard. Can you imagine what's going on in his mind?
Yeah, that's awesome.
That's probably my favorite scene.
Okay, I love it. I love it. What's your go-to song?
I don't have one. What's your go-to song?
I have so many. It really depends on.
See there?
I have so
See
many.
there?
Okay.
Okay, go ahead. We neither one have a go-to song. I will say this. I had the opportunity to go to the World Expo in Dubai 2 weeks ago, which was fabulous. We'll have to talk about that another time. And we got a semi-private concert from Coldplay, which was really pretty cool. So I'll throw that out.
That is very cool. That is cool. What's something you can't live without?
Starbucks.
What's your go-to at Starbucks?
Venti 4-pump mocha, no whip, no foam.
That is highly specific. Okay.
I do have a drinking problem, and it's their fault.
What's something in your ordinary daily life that makes your heart happy?
My Starbucks.
And last but not least, what are you grateful for right now?
I'm grateful for the chance to talk to you and your audience. And my hope is that I can add some value.
I definitely think you have. And so I want to close with one more opportunity to add value. If you could challenge leaders everywhere to practice this one behavior that would create more human workplaces and equip everyone to show up as a leader, what would that be?
To use your superpower. Back to the Hagrid story. A lot of the folks listening to this are like Harry. They've got so much potential. They've got so much power, superpowers, and they don't know it or they're denying it. Your choices are your superpower, and you can literally change your world.
Bam, mic drop. Love it.
That's all I got.
That's plenty. Thank you for writing this book and the tangible, like it's fantastic. Everyone go get it. And just thank you for the work you do. And it's been such a pleasure.
So a parting thought, let me give you my phone number, 678-612-8441, because somebody listening has a question for me and they can call or text and I'll do my best to answer.
I'm Rosie Ward, and this is Show Up as a Leader. To learn more, head over to peopleforwardnetwork.com and, of course, hit that follow button.